We keep trying. We keep at it. To end poverty, save our planet, and give everyone a shot at a decent life, only to see years of progress wiped out in a matter of months. COVID-19 has thrown millions out of work and into poverty, the economy into a tailspin, 9 out of 10 children out of school. The Sustainable Development Goals are more distant than ever, making them more necessary than ever. They are the policy vaccine to the COVID-19 crisis. We cannot fight the pandemic without a working health system. We cannot teach children remotely without technology. We cannot wash hands without clean water. The SDGs are more necessary than impossible. This year's high-level political forum is critical to put the world back on track to a better future for all. There is still time. Together, we can help the world rise stronger.
I see the mic button was mute, but we're going to start again. Welcome, everybody, to UN This Week. This is a new show about the United Nations, and we very much appreciate the new UN campaign against the infodemic of fake news about the coronavirus and the spread of misleading anti-vaccine and other anti-science conspiracy theories. Probably we have all shared content that turned out to be untrue or distorted, and we have probably engaged in unnecessary arguments on social media. Sometimes we just need to pause in our sharing social media and think. If you visit the Take Care Before You Share page, you too can sign up as a digital first responder to assist the Pause Misinformation campaign. Verifying the truth matters. We usually start with a few news items. As we saw in the first video, at the United Nations this week and the next, the annual high-level political forum on sustainable development will discuss ways to address the impacts of COVID-19 in a way that puts the world back on track to accelerate progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals during the coming final decade of action. Easier said than done. Next week, the online gathering will conclude with the adoption of a ministerial declaration on the implementation of the SDGs. This year, 47 countries will present their voluntary national reviews at the forum, sharing efforts to work towards realizing the goals while responding to the pandemic. Countries are encouraged to register new SDGs actions and models for action. Ahead of the forum, the president of the ECOSOC has also called for countries and other international actors to commit to new actions and announce them at the event adding on to the more than 150 commitments registered so far. Sounds hopeful, but interstate cooperation like this is impossible without interfaith engagement and intercultural cooperation on the community level. This is no less true in dealing with false news and conspiracy theories. So today I'm very pleased to have as a guest Ms. Grove Harris, an eco-justice and religious diversity educator and advocate who brings diverse grassroots perspectives to an international agenda. She currently serves as representative to the United Nations for the Temple of Understanding, where she has developed justice initiatives related to food sovereignty, human rights to water, interfaith education, and women's initiatives in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. Her community activism has served causes including environmental concerns, peace activism, urban open space, economic development for women, and religious freedom. As a peace commissioner, she represented the city of Cambridge at the International Association of Peace Messenger Cities in Kruševac, Serbia, and on a delegation to Bethlehem, Palestine. The Temple of Understanding has promoted global citizenship and coexistence for over 60 years. In the late 1950s, Juliet Hollister traveled the globe bearing letters of introduction from the former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt in order to gather support from the world's religious and political leaders. Since then, the Temple of Understanding has engaged in numerous programs and campaigns, including environmental, children's rights programs, and confronting Islamophobia. So welcome very much, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you first a little bit about your background. I've been a bit wordy about your background so far, but you also serve as managing director for the Pluralism Project at Harvard University up until 2007. And I was wondering, what you did there, and also if you could say something about your other interfaith work as an individual before coming to the Temple of Understanding.
Sure. I started working for the Pluralism Project when I was a graduate student at Harvard Divinity School. I'm a Wiccan priestess, and my own religious tradition I didn't feel was appropriately included. They had a gentleman do some research, but he fell into some of the kind of glamorization, and I wanted the opportunity to represent more accurately the diversity of earth-based religious practitioners across the United States. And so I approached Professor Diana Eck and got hired as a researcher. And I was thorough enough in my work that they used it to model the other religious traditions off of, although paganism is one of the smaller religious traditions. It's still important in the interfaith arena to be inclusive. And then I continued to work for them. I have an ability with databases, and I'm a pragmatic person. So I essentially worked my way up over a number of years to managing director. I was really proud of ways that I worked to help make sure that Native American traditions were fully included, because they define spirituality as an embedded day-to-day practice. So you need different search terms to call that religious practice for inclusion in our database of religious diversity news. And I was very proud to be part of capturing the religious diversity across the United States. And we were part of web development in the late 90s that included maps and databases so that we enabled people to be able to click on their state or their city and to be able to see representations of diversity in their neighbors. And that was part of the point, is to have people learn to talk to their neighbors and discuss differences and similarities and find ways in which they are working together in their communities, sending their children to the same schools, and create a visceral engagements that would help dispel any misunderstandings. So primarily an educational project, which is what a lot of interfaith work was about for a long time. at interfaith gatherings, people would come together and express their religious traditions, share some of their beliefs. So there was a lot of face-to-face communication. And also interfaith religious services also involve a lot of representation. So they try and be inclusive and can be kind of lengthy. Now the conversation has shifted more to a shoulder-to-shoulder situation where there are common causes and interfaith groups pursuing those causes, joining forces, if you will, whether it's environmental concerns, whether it's religious freedom concerns. Interfaith Power and Light, for example, would be an organization that's worked across the nation to help people access energy in more efficient ways and purchase sustainably generated electricity. So we can come together across religious traditions and have a kind of power based on our accumulated size and our shared moral values. So that's work that I was doing at the Pluralism Project that, and after a period of time, it was time for a change, and I went on to be the program director for the Parliament of World's Religions. And that opportunity enabled me to develop programming on environmental issues. And we had a strong path on Indigenous speakers. We also did a really rocking session on the Islamic tradition, trying to really strengthen that as the world needs so much more information. And also because of my own personal interests, I brought in a strong set of women's programs that by the time the Parliament was ready to roll, we could tell that there was a strong enough subset there to feature it and highlight it, because women are actors. They may not be as much in the religious leadership in every religious tradition, but they are agents and actors and service providers and deliverers and community developers and outreach workers. So it just makes so much sense in interfaith work to make sure that we are fully inclusive of what women are doing.
Yeah, I think you were active at the Melbourne Parliament of World Religions, but even the most recent in Utah, that you did some presentations there on these issues. And
yes,
I also wanted to mention before I forget that I'm active with Flushing Interfaith Council, and because we were listed on the Pluralism Project page, we get calls regularly, and we're on the map, so to speak, and we really appreciate that. And we're having a picnic, and you're welcome to come on Sunday, socially distanced, of course. Yeah, but we, the work of social justice within an interfaith frame, a multi-faith frame, sometimes can be challenging, but it's very inspiring too to see the different scriptures, the different practices that can inform the work, sort of an embodied activism, if you will. So wanted to also then ask about the interfaith work that the Temple of Understanding engages in. How is it the same? How is it different?
Actually, do you mind if I tell you a few stories before we go there?
Please.
The Parliament gatherings have been phenomenal opportunities. And when you were speaking, I was reminded of one session that we had in Melbourne, which was called Sacred Envy. And I love that session the minute it came in the door, because it gives us full reign to experience a feeling that is not a highly listed on virtues, but this idea of looking at other religious traditions to see what you might actually envy in what they have is a kind of freeing opportunity. So you can look at the Jewish tradition and perhaps be envious that they have a rigorous day off every week where they disconnect and focus on family and food and togetherness and sacraments. So that would be one thing that you could really envy. Pagans have outdoor ritual and enjoy open fires and moonlight and starlight, and that would be another thing that you could envy. Or perhaps you want to envy the global solidarity of the Islamic tradition, where people pray across the world facing in the same direction at the same times, numerous times a day. I mean, what kind of sense of unity and collective belonging that must be. So to be able to look at religious traditions and have the freedom to really engage, we don't have to just say, oh, wow, that's nice. We can really say, wow, that's something that I wish I had, and have a more robust engagement. And it's true, I've been at most of the parliaments, and one of the pleasures in Salt Lake City was to bring the activist Vandana Shiva. And she is an incredibly powerful environmental activist, political activist out of India, doing grassroots-based, but also scientifically motivated and global work. And she herself is a Hindu. And it was a great pleasure to have her calls for seed freedom. This idea that there's a corporate capture over seeds, which have traditionally belonged to people. And in their agricultural heritage, people have saved seed and used them year after year. And now the corporate capture is saying, no, you have to buy our seed and buy our fertilizer. And then you have to buy our seed again the next year because we genetically modified it to create a market. So it was a great pleasure to bring her to the parliament. And then the last parliament was actually in Toronto, and she was so well received that she was brought again to speak even much more widely. So it's a lot of my work prior to the temple and during the temple and at the UN is about bringing together disparate audiences and helping them to engage. So the activist Vandana Shiva coming to engage the religious audience, then developing that into a larger engagement. And in Toronto, working for the Temple of Understanding, we helped arrange one of the higher up folks in UN Women, Lopa Banerjee, to come to the parliament and meet with a lot of the women, both the leadership and youth who are attending, and begin to help UN Women develop their connections with women in faith traditions to create kind of synergies and solidarities moving forward.
I'm glad you said synergies because, there, on the other hand, there's silos. And at the UN, of course, we see that. But there is an interest in those working on indigenous people's rights, on women's rights, various, human rights and development goals to combine and to cross, cross fertilize.
Yes.
Yeah, pollinate. So with women's issues, whatever that means, the women's perspective, women's diverse perspectives. What does Temple of Understanding do to lift that up and to incorporate it into all its programming? Is there, of course, religious traditions have a very mixed record on women's honoring women's agency, and there's gender violence. There's all kinds of things that religious leaders may have a special role in confronting. So I was wondering if you could speak to Temple of Understanding and religions in that way.
Sure. One of the things that I do for the Temple of Understanding is work with the Women's Major Group. And that is one of the portals of civil society coming into United Nations deliberations. So I am able to represent the Temple of Understanding in that context. And the Temple does not take on every issue that the Women's Major Group does, but the Women's Major Group also is very concerned about environmental issues and food. And actually, this is supposed to be pink because one of the things the Women's Major Group does is color coding for the high-level political forum, which is happening right now, to raise up issues and show kinds of solidarity. Just so you and anybody listening knows, this is not exclusive of men by any means. And I was able to deliver what in UN speak is called an intervention of the Women's Major Group perspectives in a session on Tuesday about food, because we're all very concerned in the wake of COVID, and actually right now already, supply chains have been impacted, the resources that people have to purchase food. Hunger is a very serious issue, and something that faith traditions have taken up, forever, that kind of food provision. In that statement, I worked with colleagues, because they're collective statements, to say that it's feminist men, women's, girls, and youth initiatives, community-based initiatives, that we want to see supported to build the solutions. So this is a very practical focus on rebuilding our food distribution systems so that the supply chains are shorter. So there's that kind of practical work that women highlight. And women of faith are working with women in general to do that. Again, the leadership is not always in the faith traditions, women, but many times they are the agents and the actors. So in terms of gender-based violence, you're quite correct that right now there's a heightening of it with this. Some women are actually entrapped at home with abusers. And just yesterday, I was able to hear Ila Gandhi, the daughter of Mahatma Gandhi, who's an honoree of the temple. She convened a set of religious leaders to talk about debt and debt forgiveness, and the issue of the impacts of women in particular from COVID-19, the differentiated impacts came up. And we have to be very clear that it's not just being at home that creates violence. It is a kind of permission and a patriarchal sense of entitlement and a violent person that creates violence in frustrating circumstances. So we're putting out the call now to see in what ways the world's religions may want to step up further and talk about the way home needs to be a sanctuary for all the members in it. And this kind of patriarchal abuse is not acceptable. So that's the beginning of an outreach, and there are many who would agree with that. As you know, the discourse around family at the UN can be highly politicized, but which is essentially politics, not religion. So we have to be careful about that. But yes, I am looking for more support, specifically from different religious leaders and from the interfaith movement, to come forward, because as horrible as this pandemic is, there are also opportunities in it that need to be seized.
It sounds like the grassroots level is so important to nurture.
Yes.
And you are, I think Temple of Understanding is planning an October gathering of religious leaders around this pandemic. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Sure. We are this year celebrating a 60th anniversary. And the Temple is, I believe, the only interfaith organization, one of the oldest, and it was started, as you mentioned, by a woman, Juliet Hollister. And that is part of what is unique about this organization. So we had planned a full 2-day event for next October, and we're in the position now of obviously shifting that to deal with the global realities. And we will be rolling out a set of videos of different speakers. There will be Indigenous leadership, because the Temple in particular feels listening to the leadership of our Indigenous neighbors is so important at this time, because there's wisdom in their relatedness to the land that they are willing to share, and that our listening could be strengthened to advantage to the entire globe. We will also be featuring youth, which is another piece of what the Temple does, both at the UN and in this event. And then the following year, we're very hopeful to have a much larger in-person event. We are partnering with Marble Collegiate Church, so that's a wonderful opportunity for us, and to bring the interfaith perspective and community into that religious community for a mutual benefit. I think it's very, very important for churches that have institutional infrastructure to make sure that they're sharing it at this point in time, because we need new models for this moment in time moving forward. Yeah, I hope that's been specific enough about your question. Come back at me.
No, it's good. In fact, just for a moment, let's just take a pause for our station identification. I think our producer will run a bit of some banner across the screen. Here we are. So watch us live on Muslim Network TV. And again, my name's Adam Carroll, and I work with Justice for All, mostly for the first several years, focused pretty much exclusively on Rohingya rights and the genocide in Burma. Now we have expanded into work on behalf of other minorities that are persecuted, working with them in partnership, trying to help amplify their voice and open doors for them on Capitol Hill and in the UN. Also not always easy, as you know, but it's a long game. So with what you were saying about Indigenous people bringing something special to the table, and also working on not just climate change, but sustainability. I don't know if everyone listening to this knows what the SDGs are. I mean, it's invoked constantly in the halls of the UN, and everyone's talking about SDG 4 or 6 or 16 or whatever, and this is not something the general public is really clued into. So how do you make the SDGs accessible, and how would you kind of relate it to the work that you're doing?
Well, I can tell you that the Temple focuses on SDG 6. That's the SDG, Sustainable Development Goal, that I was privileged to work on in what was called the Open Working Group. Prior to the SDGs, there was a listening process for a year, and then there was a formulating process for another year. And I had the opportunity to work with a group called the Mining Working Group, which is mostly people of faith. And I say mostly because people who are atheist or agnostic or have a moral philosophy are welcome. So the Mining Working Group actually worked in that Open Working Group process to try and overturn extractive industries, and found an opportunity to help the UN see beyond some of the silos that you mentioned. There was a moment in time when they were considering energy and water separately. And we were able to go in and say, wait a second, these are related. If you go in and mine for oil or coal, you have huge impacts on the water. So you cannot look at those separately. You have to have an integrated approach. And at the same time, the UN has come around to really understand that religious people are providing services and need to be in partnership with the UN. And an interfaith perspective is really helpful there because it's not about anybody's particular religious tradition, but that has been a change that's happened. So there's more openness now. And so the Mining Working Group had some additional kind of cachet because we were both talking about some very specific issues, and we were made up of a lot of religious voices. So being part of that process, which was a political process, and had to boil down a bazillion different aims into a smaller set of goals, and had to fight to say, well, wait, people can only remember 5 or 8 or 10, but we have to have the complexity. So we ended up with 17. And goal number 6 includes the human right to water. And that's what happens in a text document-driven multilateral setting, that word human right to water invokes a whole lot of prior UN work and responsibilities. So there was a lot of drama, staying up all night, fighting, having different champions from different countries, others saying, forget you, jockeying to have that passed. And so for me, that goal number 6 is going to be my home. But I also appreciate working on the ocean issues. And obviously, ending poverty and hunger are, long-standing issues. And women's rights, which is in goal 5, is considered cross-cutting. So that basically means that we cannot afford to underutilize women's collective contributions, and that we have to have an equality that brings out the best in everybody in order to make the full degree of changes that we need to make on this planet. So that's the way I think about it. I've never memorized them by number because they work pretty much as organic wholes. And that's an important way to let it be. And there are, obviously there's rural and urban, which are very different settings, but those apply in a way to each of the SDGs. So those of us who are working with them, that's part of the reason you see it's a circle with the different colors and one emblem. So it's more a set of guidelines and a framework and a narrative to try and help us do real change.
I wonder, for example, thinking of the US government, which is a difficult player at the UN these days, do you see the SDGs coming up and being considered in US policy? Or is it really, do we have to wait for the election to see that?
There have been some wins recently. I think I just saw today that the protected status of grizzly bears has been upheld. There are some really inappropriate policies that have gone through that nobody wants. Business does not want to have us to go back to the Wild West of gas emission standards. Everybody was on board with struggling to get the best gas mileage and the lowest gas emissions. And we have an administration that said, let's just throw that out the window. So, and of course, air quality is related to the current COVID epidemic and thinking about people's lungs and the social justice impacts. So, I mean, I think the SDGs is still completely valid, partly because it shows, for example, that the United States is failing on water quality. And there are people called special rapporteurs who are independent researchers who go into countries by invitation and do reports that inform the world on how a country is living up to its international obligations. And we know that on poverty and on water, the US has received some failing marks. So there's definitely work to be done right smack in the US. And part of the temple's work is also to, as you were saying, link to the local, because you can go to the international level and they say, well, where's the political will? And then you have to go to the local level and say, we need to show the political will. And they say, well, where's the leadership? And both have to come back and forth to mutually enhance each other. So I'm working now near my home with the Faith Communities Environmental Network. And it's the various faith communities on Cape Cod coming together to share resources and do education and amongst ourselves and outside of ourselves about environmental issues. And people are quite dedicated, and it's a really supportive thing. And we are also linked to the Cape Cod Climate Change Coalition, which is informed by a leader who was at one of the COPs and decided to bring it home. And the faith component is now working with that, which is more focused on bringing together business leaders to say, how are we going to do this? We as local communities.
We should let people know what the COPs are.
You know, it's funny. Those are a different cup of tea. In working on the SDGs, we had to say that is another bailiwick, and that those are where the climate change environmental priorities are worked out. I have to truthfully say I have not been as involved in those as my predecessors at the temple. The conferences are international, so you need a certain amount of funding to go, except now Zoom may be a different opportunity. And we have historically worked and continue to work with the United Nations Environmental Program.
Right, and that's what the COPs are. People might think it has to do with police reform, so I don't want them to think.
No, thank you.
What's COPs stand for?
Climate, I don't even know because I use the acronym all the time. But it's about climate change standards and what we as a global community are going to do. And the U.S. is bowing out of that.
Yeah, we've stepped back. We have some questions here about that. We have one question from James asking, did the U.S. pull out of the UN? If so, why? I would say not quite pull out of the UN. How would you put that?
No, I think the U.S. is contesting the amount of money that the U.S. feels it's spending. World Health Organization, very unfortunately, although I believe the U.S. was one of the founders of it, there's now an attempt to pull out of it. However, that does take over a year to accomplish. So I have hope that we will come to understand that a pandemic is really a good time to work with our neighbors around the globe, and that we really need a international perspective about what kind of justice issues are we going to use to figure out how we develop the vaccines that we need, who's going to get them, who's going to profit off of the production of them, and how can we make this an opportunity for justice in the health realms for our entire globe. So no, I would not say the U.S. has pulled out of the UN. We're also a member of the Security Council. We were going to convene the G7. So no, the U.S. is firmly in the UN, but making a lot of trouble right now.
Yeah, it's the bull in the China shop approach. And other big countries like Russia and China play the same game, unfortunately. But then many of the smaller fish really learn to swim in those schools. You know, that image of all the little fish forming the shape of a giant fish and gobbling up the bully fish. Anyway, there's a lot of maneuvering going on among the nation states, but the U.S. has taken its funding away from WHO and from also UNESCO over Israel, and also left Human Rights Council.
Yes,
when it
steps as well, I believe.
And when it steps away, it reduces its impact, and we lose whatever leverage we had. So this is a difficult time to be American, but
I think these are very difficult times, and I don't want to ever underestimate the need for resources. And that's partly why we have to look at the debt issues around the globe. But we also need to look at those as an extractive industry. And to say that a lot of the debt that has gone to fund certain kinds of development has funded development that has benefited the extractors. So there's really an opportunity for a lot of change now. One of the things we have to be careful about is this neoliberal growth model, because we know we're going to be looking at non-growth. However, we can measure other things. The Temple of Understanding some years back put on a conference with our various colleagues at the Church Center, and the title was What Makes for Peace? Health, Food, and Water. And it was a fascinating conference because we tried to get at the pragmatic things that we think are necessary to have peace. And we did not say the biggest GDP or the biggest bank account or the least amount of debt or the most amount of debt. That's not what makes for peace. So there are other things that we can think about measuring, and we need to never let go of the human ingenuity. That's an American, the creativity and the innovation. I was really inspired to hear some young women speaking this week at the High Level Political Forum on a project they did. Menstrual hygiene rights are part of how we need to create a level playing field so that girls can stay in school and continue to be equals, and women can have what they need to be professional equals throughout their lifespans. So they had a German company where they were marketing sanitary products, but they found that tampons were going to be taxed at the rate of 17% for sale, whereas luxury goods were only being taxed at 7%, including books. So what they did is they designed a book cover and packaging in which they sold tampons. So they were able to, in a humorous and accessible way, get around a legal finding that was unnecessarily harmful to women. And I believe that A, they were able to sell their product, and B, that the tax laws have been adjusted. So I just offer that to inspire people in the audience to think about ways that there are potential breakthroughs that are possible. I'm not saying, wow, it's all going to be fixed by technology, but I was at an oceans conference, and one of the technologies they featured there is a solar-powered, wave-generated desalinization plant. Now, that means that a country that is running out of fresh water but is on the ocean has a way to harness solar and wave energies and help salt water become drinkable. Otherwise, that's a really high energy sink trying to have that happen. So
well, that's the kind of next wave that I can really look forward to.
Exactly. Breakthrough technologies, and hope is important.
And that is the kind of aspect of the challenge we face that I think Americans can embrace and our government can value, because maybe there's a chance to make some money doing so. But I think, creativity is not religious practice is certainly not opposed to creativity. I mean, it can be, but I think you've very much tried to connect the two in your work and your service. I see someone, Nina, commented, "Thank you that you and your organization do for all you do. All faiths have to unite for the cause of humanity. Politics has become an obstacle." So I was wondering, since we have to finish in just a minute, if there's a website. James is asking, and it's a good point to end. If there's a website, both not just for your work, but also for projects regarding interfaith and women's rights that you would recommend.
I would start with the Temple of Understandings, and I will be posting there and in Facebook. And the opportunities now are huge. Two of the largest interfaith and multi-faith organizations are now headed by women for the first time ever. So the idea that women are leaders is now demonstrated, accepted fact. So, and it may be partly because we have hard times that the opportunities are being handed out, but still, it's if you look at the work that Dr. Aza Karam is doing for in Religions for Peace, it is phenomenal. She has, within 6 months, been everywhere doing everything. So women weighing in on things like debt, because our global economy, like our global ecology, they both come from the word oikos, which means home. We need to manage our global household, and women have long been doing that. So I think you can see women's leadership being demonstrated in political realms, in religious realms, etc. So these are exciting times, and the justice-based issues that are coming up now, the whole set of them really bodes well for some real transformations based on communities knowing how we need to feed ourselves, how we want to treat our neighbors, how we'd like to live in peace, how we'd like to have health, food, and water, that those are more important to us than what happens in the stock market per se. So these are exciting times that we've all been born for. Thank you so much. Grove Harris from Temple of Understanding, thank you for that hope. And we'll close on that note. So thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.
Sure.